Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another episode of The Future of Work with Jacob Morgan and my very special guest today, Marc Randolph, the co-founder and the first CEO of a very tiny company that some of you out there may be familiar with called Netflix. Marc, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you. And believe me, it was a small, tiny little company no one had heard of back when I was doing it.
Oh, I know. And I'm very, very excited to ask you about that too, because I'm so fascinated with these journeys of how companies go from a small handful of people to basically changing the world. But before we get into that, I'm really curious to learn just more about you. How did you grow up? What were you like as a kid? I mean, how did your path in life take you to becoming the co-founder and first CEO of Netflix?
Well, of course, these things are never, you don't live things in a linear way. And I certainly didn't grow up aspiring to one day do a giant streaming company. Who could have thought? But looking backwards, you could see there were certain patterns. I was always kind of entrepreneurial. I mean, it's almost stereotypical now. When someone grows up doing candy arbitrage, or I sold seeds door to door. I was always doing things and trying to make them a little bit better, or trying to find some interesting problem I could solve. I had a little notebook, even when I was a little kid, that I wrote down my inventions in. So, but I actually think it's one of the keys to being an entrepreneur is practice, practice, practice. And even then, all the little things I was doing, I was always starting things in high school and in college. But those all preparation for the time you begin doing it at a larger scale. I mean, even just picking something, at college, even just starting a club or starting a magazine, both of them involve things like trying to convince people to help you. When you
Yeah.
can't pay them, they just need to work for some amorphous benefit. And then you have to go to the student council and convince them to give you money. And then you have to go to the university and convince them to give you space. But all of those acts of trying to convince someone to believe in you, to try and paint a picture of what you're trying to create, that's the exact same process you would go through trying to create anything, whether it's a tiny little club or whether it's going to ultimately be a multi-billion-dollar company.
Do you remember any of the inventions that you wrote down as a kid in your notebook?
No, yes, but they're ridiculous. I mean, these are the ideas of a 8-year-old kind of thing. But I have a friend who we tease each other because we used to talk about inventions, and I think one of mine was a hairbrush that rotated, so you could just hold it in one place. It would brush your hair. We used to tease, which you can see I experimented on myself, and this is the result.
A hairbrush that rotates. I like it. And then candy arbitrage, man. So you were doing all sorts of things even when you were a little kid. So perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that you got involved with Netflix. So when you got older, I mean, how did your introduction to Netflix begin? How did you end up connecting with Reed? What was the whole story of where this began?
Well, it began the way a lot of things begin, with unemployment. I had a small startup that I was helping run, and we ended up being sold, which was a great outcome because the investors made money and our stock options are worth something. But we ended up going to work at this big new startup, and as luck would have it, it was a company that had been started and was currently being run by a gentleman named Reed Hastings. And the second bonus is that Reed and I lived in the same town. And so we began carpooling to work together. And I got to know Reed pretty well, so that when lightning struck again and our larger company was being acquired, and we both realized we're going to be losing our jobs in this merger, it was a natural to say, what next? And for me, the what next was starting another company. Because Netflix was my sixth. So I had done a bunch before, and I saw some things I wanted to try. And Reed did not want to start another company. He actually at that time wanted to be an educational philanthropist. He was going to go back to school. He was going to try and change the world, which he's made a lot of progress on, actually. But once you're an entrepreneur, you're always an entrepreneur. And he wanted to kind of keep a hand in. And so we came to an agreement that he'd be my angel investor. He would chair my board. I would start and run the company, hire the people, etc. But what's the company? And we needed the idea. And so the way this worked is for months, literally for months, on our carpools, Reed would pick me up and we'd spend the entire drive, an hour or so, brainstorming ideas. I'd get in and I'd pitch him. And then he would surgically dissect the idea. And just to give you an example of the kind of crazy stuff going on in the car.
Yeah, I want to hear about these.
Okay, here's one. Personalized dog food. We're going to formulate a blend exactly for your pet, for its breed, for its age, for its gender, its activity level, the climate, whatever. And then you're going to subscribe to it. And Reed didn't think that was so good. I found all kinds of flaws. So, okay, here's another one. Custom shampoo. Cut off a lock of your hair, you mail it to us. My team of crack hair scientists formulate the custom blend just for you. And again, you subscribe to it. And I didn't like that. So another one, video rental by mail. And that one I really like because that was like an $8 billion category. And, Blockbuster was a disappointing experience. But the flaw was that this was 1997, just to put it in perspective. And so let's see, looking at you. Yeah, maybe you were around. Maybe you watched Lion King a couple hundred times on a VHS cassette. But yeah, but it didn't work. They were too heavy, they were expensive, they were fragile. And so that idea ended up in the same heap on the side of the road, along with the shampoo and the dog food. And then came one of those fortuitous startup breaks. Reed read about this technology called the DVD. and it was entering test market in a handful of cities. And I think if we had just randomly heard about DVDs, we never would have made the leap to video rental by mail. But it ended up, it was like kind of that experience that probably all of us have had, where you're cleaning up and you, underneath the couch, you find a missing jigsaw puzzle piece.
Yeah.
And you're like, what the, oh, that's the missing piece from that puzzle that I was doing 2 months ago. And so it was that this was the missing piece to that video rental by mail puzzle. And so rather than rushing to do a business plan or do a pitch deck or any kind of BS like that, we turned the car around right away and drove back to Santa Cruz to see if we could validate this idea, and looked for a DVD, but of course it was not available. So we settled on a used music CD, and then went a few doors down and bought a little pink gift envelope, like you put a greeting card in. Then took it to the Santa Cruz post office, put the DVD in, addressed it to Reed, stamped it and dropped it in the slot, and went to work. And next day, Reed picked me up and didn't even say anything, just held up his little envelope with an unbroken CD that had gotten to his house in less than 24 hours for the price of a stamp. And if there was ever a, well, as I say in screenwriter speak, if there was an inciting event, this was it. This was probably the point where we said, this actually might work. And
so, yeah. So what happened next? So you tested that out. Well, first, even before we get to that, you had lots of ideas. How did you guys decide that the Netflix idea would work, whereas the shampoo idea wouldn't and the dog food wouldn't? Was it just kind of like Reed's just personal feeling, or did you do market tests and all this analysis, competitors looking at all that sort of stuff in the space?
Yes, maybe you're making it sound a bit more glamorous than it is, because don't forget, I knew nothing about video rental. Neither did Reed. We had zero experience in the video business, and it wasn't like we were film people either. You know, it was not like those car rides we were debating who the best French film directors were or something like that. We knew nothing, and so it did occur to us that it just might make a little sense to figure out some things about video rental before we did this. And so I did a lot of sniffing around. And I mentioned that I had done a handful of startups before on Netflix, and several of them, well, a handful were, a few of those were actually, mail order companies, direct response companies. And so I did know what questions to ask. I had relationships with all the carriers from having shipped with Federal Express and UPS and DHL. I knew how to do that. I knew what packaging costs. I knew a lot of that stuff, so I could begin doing the research into it. But it turned out it was one of those problems where normally when you're doing research on an idea, you're going, this is great. And then you turn over yet one more rock and there's a big, ugly something underneath it. And you go, oh, okay, I knew I'd bump into something like that. Or you find out, oh, it exists and it's been proven that it's a terrible idea. But this idea went through this point where all of a sudden, the more we learned, the more we liked it. And it gave it some velocity. But fundamentally, and this is true not just of Netflix, but I think of any startup, you can never know. You are doing something that's never been done before. This was not like we could look at some other DVD rental by mail startup and see how they did. The only way sometimes to figure something out is to do it. And the lack of the non-entrepreneur is that standing on the edge of the cliff and they're looking and they're going, there must be a way around. And they spend weeks trying to figure out how to avoid the void. Oh, I like that. How to avoid the void. But what we have to do is go, the only way we're going to find out is by trying it. And so you step off the edge and see what you find. And so, Reed wrote a check for $2 million. I leased an office. I hired a dozen people, and we set about building an e-commerce website, acquiring a copy of every DVD in existence, trying to find some way to promote it to this tiny audience of DVD owners. And on April 14th of 1998, off we went.
That must have been quite an experience, because obviously there's like 24 to 30 of you, There's many, many millions of people out there, and I'm sure DVDs, they were just starting to grow. I mean, how did you scale to keep up with that? What happens if you had like 200 DVDs in a day? Obviously it's not easy to sort and acquire and ship. I mean, how did you deal with all that?
I wish we had that problem. That so my book is called That'll Never Work, because that is what every single person told me when I pitched that idea, including my wife. And they had a bunch of reasons, but once we launched, we're going to do great. But it turned out that they were right, that this was a terrible idea, and that we could not get anyone to rent from us. Wow. We could convince someone to rent once, and they would never rent again. And I guess in retrospect, it isn't that surprising. There was not a tremendous amount of business model innovation. There was due dates and there was late fees. And of course, there was Blockbuster with their 9,000 stores. So the idea of someone coming to our website with its better selection and its easier way to pick a movie, but then waiting 3 days for the movie to arrive, was probably not too compelling an offer. So we had the opposite problem. We were desperately in search of something that we could do to try and unlock this, to try and figure out some way to get DVD rental to work. And what was even worse was that at the time, as a sideline, or so we thought, we also sold DVDs. We figured, since we had gone to all the trouble to find a source for every single DVD out there, we'll sell them. And that part of the business was doing incredibly well. That was like 98% of our revenue. But it was a false signal, because we knew that it was just a matter of time before Amazon began selling DVDs, and then Walmart and Kmart and, I don't know, PetSmart. And then pretty soon the margins go to zero and we're out of business. And the worst of all is that doing both of them at the same time was brutal. It was confusing, and designing the checkout was tricky, and the inventory management and the arguing about the metrics all the time. And so we knew not only was rental not working, but we couldn't continue to let sales subsidize rental, because ironically, any time we focused on sales was making it less likely we'd get rental right. And so then we had to make this brutal decision to walk away entirely from the sales, and focus it all on rental. And that just added to the pressure. So that's a long way of saying, I wish this thing had just taken off right out of the box and I had to scramble. Instead, it was the opposite.
So that's crazy. So you walked away from what was generating 90% of the revenue for the company, and moved to something that was barely making any money for the business. I mean, that's a pretty big, bold, strategic change for the business. How did you guys even decide that? Because most companies today, if you say walk away from what makes almost every dollar for the company to do this other thing, they'd be like, what are you, nuts? How did you get to that decision?
So looking back, again, I'm not patting myself on the back here. I agree. It was a tremendously brave thing to do. But I did have Reed as a sounding board. He was chair of my board of directors. And we both almost intuitively said to ourselves, we would rather have the extremely unlikely case that we can make a big success than the almost sure choice of having a decent sized company that little by little faded away into oblivion. We symbolically just wanted to go for the bigger prize, even though the odds were longer. But the real decision was the realization of how important focus was. That even though it seemed like, why can't we keep selling DVDs to at least pay the bills? It was the realization that doing one wasn't just a sideline. It actually subtracted from our ability to do the other. That the focusing on the singular thing you wanted to happen was the critical ingredient. But the point you made is the big one, which is that right now, so many companies can see what they should do, but they lack the ability, or even worse, lack the courage to do it. And it's even worse, of course, if it's a public company And
Yep.
walking away from 98% of your revenue is reflected in the public markets, and your valuation crashes, and everyone hates you, and everyone's living quarter to quarter. I mean, it's always, always, always a really hard decision. But fundamentally, the customer doesn't care about any of that. They don't care about your stock price. They don't
Yep.
care about your all those things. They just want a certain way of doing business with you. And if you're unwilling to do that because you're going to hold on desperately to the old way, well, someone else will gladly put their hand up and go, I'll serve the customer for you.
Yeah. No, very true. So you had no customers at the beginning. Nobody was renting from you. How did you change that? You walked away from the sales side of the business. And what is it that finally got the Netflix engine revving up?
So we went on for a year and a half. I mean, no exaggeration, 18 months of struggling to figure out a model. And it's not like every single test was a failure, because you learn a little bit each time and you get closer and closer. But we were simultaneously tweaking, but also trying bold strokes. And we had one big bold stroke left in the can. And it came from this one day when Reed and I happened to be in the warehouse together. And at that point, we probably had several 100,000 DVDs, all neatly shelved all around us. And we were talking about how much money was just sitting there. And the realization came, why are we storing all these movies here where they do no one any good? Wonder if there's a way to store them at the customers' houses. And we first were talking about it. We do a peer-to-peer thing. But we eventually said, why can't we just let people keep the movies? Let them take as long as they need to watch it. And when they're done, they'll mail it back and we'll replace it. And then we had the discussion, well, listen, if they mail it in, no one is ever going to come to the website and pick the next one. We know how hard that is to get someone to do. So let's have them make a list of all the movies they want to see. So when one comes in, we automatically know the next one to send them. And then we also said, why don't we make it a subscription business? Why charge them each time they swap? And we said, great, we'll do subscription. And then we had this big argument because the first half of my career, I was a direct marketer, direct response guy. So one of my mantras is you can't test multiple variables at the same time. You can't tell the result. And Reed was going, we don't have time for that. Let's put all three of these things together and let's just do it.
Wow.
And we said, okay. And we rolled all three of those things together into one program. We tested it and boom, unbelievable success. I actually was doing someone emailed me for a piece they were doing and they said, tell us about product market fit. How do you define product market fit? And all I could say is it's not unlike, I guess it's Justice Stewart who said that it's like pornography, which is, it's really hard to define it, but you know it when you see it. And product market fit is like that. It's like, boom, you're pressed back in your seat. You can't keep up. And that was the moment where Netflix kind of stopped being a startup and in some ways became a real company.
So it's kind of crazy to me because you hear so many stories from entrepreneurs where they say, before you do something, you got to test, you got to do like all this crazy stuff before you roll something out. But it seems like when you guys decided to pivot to that subscription model, you didn't do that. You just kind of knew, so to speak, that it was going to work and you did it. So it kind of goes against the conventional entrepreneurial grain of start small, test, go gradually. You kind of just went all into this.
No, that's not correct. In fact, because it was a test. We didn't all of a sudden walk away from the business and say, boom, we're going to do this thing. This was test number 1,637 after 600, whatever, they can't even do the count, failed tests. This was just one more thing we were trying. It was done to a small group. And in fact, it wasn't even an acquisition test. It was going to existing customers and saying, how would you feel if we offered you a program like this? And so, everyone said, we'd love that. But the big thing was, we then said as an acquisition test, we said, we're going to try it. We're going to give you 30 days free. That was the test. And so what was terrifying is we had these stats that said everyone loved it. And then when we offered the 30-day free trial, the subscription rate was huge. But for 30 days, it was pins and needles, waiting to see who would cancel. And I knew some would cancel in the first 2 or 3 days, but then almost no one did. And then a week goes by, and 2 weeks, and 3 weeks. And then we had set it up to automatically hit their credit cards on day 31. And as that day got closer, I kept waiting because again, direct marketing background, including 2 magazines that I had helped launch. I knew how free trials work, and I was just waiting, and it didn't happen. And that's the moment we said, this is incredible. There's almost no churn. We have got a winner. And that was the point where we began unraveling everything for the exact same reasons that we walked away from selling it. We did have a reasonably good business of people who were doing the a la carte rental, the due dates and late fees one at a time. But we said it's so complicated trying to offer both of these programs. Forget that old stuff. From now on, Netflix is unlimited DVDs, no due dates, no late fees, and no due dates and late fees is Netflix, and never looked back.
So I'm assuming at that point, that's when things really started to kind of take off and grow exponentially. And I'm curious about kind of the scaling, the growth, the culture piece, because at that point, I would imagine you were, scrappy, 24 or so people, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe you weren't thinking as much about like culture and, all that sort of stuff. It was just kind of, getting stuff going. But then as you grew and you brought in more people, you really started to have to think about the hiring process, culture. So how did you start having those conversations to develop Netflix into what it is now?
So, no, doesn't work like that. Culture is not what you say. Culture is not what you put in a culture deck. Culture is not what you carve in your headstone. Culture is not something you sit around a table and brainstorm things like, what should our culture be? Culture is how you act. It's how you are. It's the things you do. And even more importantly, culture springs from how the founders and the early employees act with each other, with their employees, with their customers. Yeah. And so huge amounts of the Netflix culture arise organically from the way that Reed and I behave, the way that I treat people, the way I worked with people before. When we did Netflix and I glossed over, I said, we raised the money, we got an office, we hired a dozen people. I didn't put ads for hiring people. This was more like that scene from the Blues Brothers movie where I'm driving around getting the band back together. So I'm going to these people who I've worked with before, who I know well enough to know how they work. And you're finding these people who I know can work autonomously, who I know enjoy that, who I know enjoy the fact that they come to work not knowing what they're going to face, but will rise to the challenge of whatever happens. So I'm laying that out because you have to understand that what was there was there. That culture was just organically part of who we were. But you make a really good point, is that those attributes I was just describing about people having tremendous amounts of responsibility for their things, but wanting the autonomy to work by themselves, to really love having their job be different. That's an easy culture to maintain when you have a dozen people. But what happens is as companies get larger, it's very easy to lose that. At the beginning, and pardon me if I digress a little bit, but this is all about how you work with people. At the beginning, it's really easy to tell one of these chosen few and go, Christina, you see that mountain 2 miles away? I'll meet you there. And you know that here's the things you need to get accomplished. And she goes, got it. And then I don't even think about it again, because I know that 2 weeks from now, I will find Christina on top of the mountain, maybe bruised and bloodied, but she'll be there on time with everything she's responsible for. That she'll have solved every problem that came her way on her own without input from me. That's a great way of working. But what happens is when you get bigger, something happens where someone shows up late, or they show up, don't have everything done. And a lot of managers would say, oh, this isn't good. Okay, we can't have that happen again. Everybody, I want status reports. I need to know if there's going to be a problem in advance. So everyone status reports. And everyone goes, oh, status reports. And then someone else shows up and they're there on time with it all done, but they spent too much. And many managers would go like, oh, can't let that happen. okay, I need everyone who spends more. I want to pre-approve anything over $100 to make sure you don't make a spending mistake. And then everyone goes, oh God, expense reports. And little by little, what you're doing is you're building a company to protect yourself from people with bad judgment. But what you're also doing is driving the people who have good judgment crazy. And so we kind of decided what would happen if we built a company that was for people with good judgment, people who loved having that freedom to make their own decisions, to be close to the action, to decide for themselves what the appropriate thing to do was, but had the responsibility of knowing that we counted on them to get those things done. And I will confess, we almost lost it, because as we got bigger, as hiring got to a point where I didn't know everybody anymore. They didn't all have contact with myself or with Reed.
Yeah.
You began to lose some of that inadvertently. And then we kind of had some problems, which I'm sure we can talk about in a little bit, that required us to have a layoff. And we needed to lay off nearly 40% of our company. And there was that classic managerial problem of saying, we're going to have to do everything we did before, but with 40% less people, this is going to be really hard. But instead, as we moved into that period, it was the opposite. It was fun. It was exciting. It felt like we were a startup again, because there was no time for the command and control. We were back to see you on the mountain in 2 weeks. And we had gotten the staff back down to the place where the only people there were the people with good judgment that we could trust, that wanted to work that way. And that, I think, is the point where we said we have to be actively trying to maintain this culture. We have to call each other on it when we're not doing this. And then began that longer process led by Patty McCord, who was our head of human resources at the time, to say, how do you scale this beyond 200? How do you scale it to 2,000? How do you scale it to 7,000 where they are now? And that, I think, is part of the ongoing Netflix culture experiment, which is, how do you create this freedom, this culture of freedom and responsibility, this culture of radical honesty, but not just in a small company, but in fact in a very, very large one.
Yeah, and Patty actually was a guest on this show 2 years ago, I think. So a little while ago, and we talked about some of that stuff as well. But you mentioned something that I wanted to touch on, which is you did go through some tough times, letting go 40% of the workforce, which for most companies would be, completely disastrous. So can you share a little bit about what happened during that time period? Why did you have to let go 40% of the workforce? And even just how you got to that decision, because that's not an easy choice to make, especially for a leader of the company. So how did you kind of go through that process and deal with
it? So it's actually picks up right after the huge success of the no due dates, no late fees program. And it was a subscription, as I pointed out. And as you probably are aware, in a subscription business, you pay a lot of money to acquire that customer. And especially if there's a first month free, that acquisition cost is substantial. But it's okay, because in a subscription program, that customer now pays you a little bit month after month after month, hopefully for 2 or 3, 4 years. And you get back the acquisition cost and much more. But what it means is you are losing money. There's a cash flow big issue for each new customer that comes in. So when all of a sudden, no due dates, no late fees takes off, it's fantastic. New customers are flooding in. But of course, there is a commensurate flooding out of cash. And this wasn't a problem, because this was what's the problem? It's fall of 1999, spring of 2000. Money's easy. We just kind of go outside on Highway 17. We hold up the green flag, and the big money truck pulls off and backs up and dumps it all into the driveway. And we just come out with the wheelbarrows and bring in the money. Easy. We can subsidize this forever, until the dot-com bubble bursts. And all of a sudden, those drivers of the money trucks are now shielding their face from us and accelerating past the exit. So no money. And ironically, we're going to go broke being successful. So we did the thing that a prudent entrepreneur does, which is we decided to pursue the strategic alternatives everyone's always so fond of, which means we got to sell the company or at least find someone to absorb these losses.
So you actually explored selling Netflix.
Absolutely. We were aggressively trying to sell it, but there was one strategic alternative, which was the obvious one, and that was Blockbuster. And we decided that is the perfect person because we'll do the online business, they'll do the stores. Even better, we'll make a blended model and we will rule the world. But they wouldn't answer our phone calls, they wouldn't answer the emails, we couldn't get a meeting. It took us months until finally they did say, come meet us. We'll see you in Dallas tomorrow morning. And then we go, okay, well, tomorrow morning, I guess. And so we actually chartered a jet, we had $50 million in debt, and we chartered a jet because we had to get there. We go, what the hell? At this point, all or nothing. And pitched to Blockbuster. And we thought it was going great. And then Reed told them, we want $50 million. And they laughed at us, essentially. And went downhill pretty quickly after that, as you can imagine. But that's what came next is we had thought that once we got the meeting, done, solved, that this was the deus ex machina, the hand of God that rescues our plucky heroes from the face of impending doom. And instead, not only were they not going to save us, now Blockbuster was going to compete with us. So flying home was a very, very depressing flight because we realized there was no easy way out now. And that if we were going to make it happen, we would have to, as my dad often said, that sometimes the only way out is through, and that we would have to solve this without anyone's help, that we would have to get from where we were to cash flow break even on our own. And there was no way we were going to do that at the rate we were bleeding, at the rate we had hired people, at the current business model. And the only alternative was to dramatically trim the sales. That led to, unfortunately, having to say, we've got to say goodbye to people. And I'm sure you've had guests who've talked about this experience before, but that is the absolute worst, especially for a startup leader where almost every single one of these people I had convinced to come join us. I had them, leave great jobs with security and great benefits to join us on this journey, the almost impossible quest. And they'd put everything they had into it. And they'd worked so hard. And now we were having to say goodbye. And that is the most painful thing you can almost ever do.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. And so after you got through that process, how did you steer the Netflix ship back on track? So what did you fix that then allowed the company to keep growing again?
Well, so the first thing I need to mention is that this is way beyond me at this point. I mean, now we have built a reasonably good team. So we are all singularly focused on making this successful. So part of that is working on a lot of things like unit economics. It's working on boring things, not to me. I think it's incredibly fascinating, but, working on your unit economics, working on bringing your acquisition costs down, lowering your churn, working on you're increasing the conversion rate by which people who arrive at the site actually turn into subscribers.
The nitty gritty stuff of business.
Unfortunately so.
Yeah.
But with a fresh eye toward this is no longer just optimization. This is survival. That if we can't figure this out, even things like how to get content less expensively. I mean, all kinds of really, really nitty gritty. We've got to get ourselves onto an even keel. And we had some huge lucky breaks and some big breakthroughs that I'm pretty sure we wouldn't have either found without this focus. But more importantly, if we hadn't had them, we wouldn't have made it out. And a lot of those things are what contributed further to the acceleration of the company. And that acceleration allowed us to address the public markets, not too long after the collapse. So, success at a company is, one small part hard work, but wow, there's a huge amount of luck involved.
Yeah.
And we certainly had our share of it.
One of the things that I find completely fascinating is so you actually went to Blockbuster, and I actually had the former CEO of Blockbuster as a podcast guest, Nigel Travis, which I don't know if he was the CEO. I have to look at the dates. I don't know if he was the CEO when you guys were pitching them. But what fascinates me is that Blockbuster knew about you because you wanted to sell to them, and it just blows my mind. Did they not take you seriously? Did they not think that Netflix was like going to be a real thing? Why did they? Essentially, you put them out of business. You were the tiny company wanting money from them. How did that happen?
So it's complicated, but in a nutshell, yes, they absolutely knew about us, but there were several things that they miscalculated about. The first one is we met them after the dot-com bubble had burst, when dot-com was almost a joke, when it was almost proving right. All the people who said, oh, this internet thing, flash in the pan. And so here they were saying, you see,
shocks me.
It's all a bunch of smoke and mirrors, this whole internet thing. So they were prone to discount that this was a viable business for the future. That's one big thing. The second thing, and this needs to go back a bit, I referred to the fact about the book being called That'll Never Work, because everyone said that. Yeah. And they said it for one reason, is because of the 9,000 Blockbuster stores. The other reason is because they were all seeing that eventually video would be digital and video would be streamed or downloaded. Mm-hmm. And they were right, but they were wrong about the timing. So at the time that we were talking to Blockbuster and they were looking at our DVD by mail business through the internet, they were also talking to another big successful company about doing a joint streaming venture. And that company was Enron, if you are familiar with them.
Oh my God.
So they were thinking, why waste our time with this stupid little DVDs in an envelope business? We all know the future is this, and Blockbuster can lead that charge. So that was number two. But the fundamental big one, and this in my opinion is what really took it down, is because they didn't take us seriously, they didn't invest sufficiently in making it happen. And they didn't invest sufficiently in a number of dimensions. First of all, they didn't put their A team on it, which I can totally understand that. Why would they take their very best engineers and pull them away from the business, which is doing 98% of the revenue, or more in their case, and shift it over to something which was going to be tiny, at least for the foreseeable future? And as a result, their efforts to compete were very lame for 2, 3, 4 tries. And finally, on the 4th or 5th try, they did, to their credit, get it right. They said they took a team, they funded it adequately, they moved it out of their building and gave them complete autonomy and said, you've got to get us in that business. And they would have taken us down, in my opinion. They would have done the blended model that we were pitching, and the blended model would have beaten us. However, at the time, they had some boardroom intrigue and decided that the cash flow that was coming from all those Blockbuster stores was better off being allocated out to investors rather than being put back into the business to fund a transformation into a different business, into the future. And that's what sunk them.
So you think if they would have gone all in to compete with you head to head, they would have crushed you guys?
I think so. Crushed us is probably too strong. I think they would have beaten us because they would have been offering everything we offered. Plus, they would have been able to say, but if you want to return rather than mailing your movies back, just drop them off at a Blockbuster store and then pick up another one. Or pick it up and then mail it back. Or we'll mail it to you and you can. That blended model would have been very powerful. And we knew this because we, of course, had done a fair amount of research into what customers wanted and how they'd respond. And we were actually very scared that they would do that. And so when they did, and when they dropped prices, they took a very aggressive competitive stance against us and were making serious headwinds into taking away our growth, taking away our customers. It's actually really interesting, and that this is not something that it's talked about briefly in the book, but really interesting story about how close we came to actually being beaten.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy because it's there's obviously a lot of smart people there, MBAs, very very smart people who made a very very big mistake and it ended up costing the business.
Yep.
But would you say in this case it was more like Netflix beat Blockbuster or Blockbuster beat themselves?
I think Blockbuster beat themselves. I fundamentally believe that, but partly this is a transformation that would have changed one way or the other.
Yeah.
Whether Netflix was there or not, we certainly weakened them. The fact that they had a bricks and mortar business model meant that you didn't need to take away half their customers. You just needed to take away 10% of their customers because their fixed costs were such that they couldn't drop their costs by 10%. They had buildings, they had employees. And worse, the 10% that we took were their best customers. Did you? Oh, there you go.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Yeah, it was one of my first jobs. And I mean, to me, it's still mind blowing because I remember in Southern California, like Blockbuster was like Starbucks. I mean, they were on every corner. And I remember when I worked there, sometimes you would have a line like almost out the door of people who were coming in to rent. And I just thought, oh man, this is amazing. Nothing is going to take out Blockbuster. And then here comes along Netflix, and slowly, they just vanish. And it's, Circuit City, Good, so many of these companies who could not adapt. I mean, it still blows my mind that so many smart people who studied business and got MBA degrees, some of the world's smartest business leaders worked at these companies and just could not see it coming, could not adapt. So it just goes to show that sometimes smart people make big mistakes.
It's happening now. I mean, it is happening. I don't even mean COVID. I mean, it was happening now, even prior to these disruptions. I mean, I did this work with, I won't talk about who it is specifically, but it was a company who sold multi-level. They sold to distributors sold to retail stores, and retail stores sold to customers. So, and it gets marked up each time through that process. And so it's expensive. And of course, people were starting to buy direct. And they felt trapped because if they went direct, all of a sudden the CEO is getting calls from the distributor saying, I represent 20% of your business and you're going to compete with me? And if you keep doing that, I'm out of here. And they go, okay, oh, no. And then the next person in the door is their VP of sales who's making $400,000 a year or $500,000 a year and saying, you're making my job harder, not easier. If you're going to keep doing this, well, then screw it. I'm going to go work somewhere else. He goes, oh, no. I mean, it takes tremendous courage to say, I see where the world is going. It is going direct. We have no choice but to go there, and we have to absorb that pain or we're toast. So Blockbuster is not that they're foolish or stupid. There were very smart people there, but they were trapped. They had all these stores. They had all this revenue coming in. It was extremely hard for them to say, we'll walk away from all that and bet it all on building this business, which is also going to go away, which it was. We're going to enter the DVD by mail business knowing we're going to have to transition again once there finally is a streaming business, which of course we all knew from the very beginning, including Netflix.
So I want to talk about your Randolph's rules for success, because I thought those were fascinating. But before we jump into that, just maybe one final question about Netflix. And that is, from your time at Netflix, from taking a company from 2-3 people to many, many thousands, what do you think the greatest lesson learned is for leaders who are listening to this podcast who want to learn from what you did? I mean, do you have any advice to leaders out there who are looking to create better company where people want to show up?
The thing that I've learned over and over and over again is that there's no such thing as a good idea. That too many companies believe that there are good ideas and the people who have them the proportion of good ideas is commensurate with how high you are in the company. And I've learned that's just ridiculous. And that the only way to find out whether ideas are good or bad is to try them. And so the trick is not building an organization which is good at coming up with ideas, but building an organization which is tremendously good at trying thousands of bad ideas. And that means empowering people to make mistakes. It means pushing the decision-making down to the people closest to the places those decisions need to get made. These are easy things to say, and anyone who's been in that position knows how incredibly hard it is to do, but that doesn't change the importance of doing it. And all these journeys have to start with a single step. And that just comes from, like I said, culture stems not from what you say, from what you do. And the most effective way to build a culture of innovation and risk-taking is to demonstrate it at the top.
I love that. I love that. I think that's great advice. So I want to wrap up with the Randolph's rules for success, because these are things that I think anybody can apply in their life, in their career, whether you're a leader or an entry-level employee. Did these rules come from things that you yourself did, or from things that you looked for in others when you were hiring them, a combination of both?
Actually, none of the above. In fact, when I was in my early 20s and about to start my very first job, my father called me in to the den where he was sitting and tore a piece of paper off a yellow pad and handed it to me, where he had in longhand, in pen, written out his Randolph's rules for success, which he wanted to give to me on the eve of me starting my first job. Wow. And that actual piece of paper, now I have framed and hangs in my bathroom next to my sink so I can see it every morning. And I've given it to my kids. And of course, it's now in the book too. But the interesting thing about the ideas, and my dad was an investment banker. My dad worked on Wall Street his entire life. So it could very easily have been that the rules for success were things like, buy low and sell high, or happiness is positive cash flow, or some such bullshit like that. But instead, what these really were are how to be a decent person, and that being a decent person works. It was things like don't knock, don't complain, be considerate up and down, be open-minded but skeptical, quantify when possible, never, ever to anybody present as fact things about which you do not know are true. Be prompt. These are not like earth-shattering ones, but they're a reminder that fundamentally success in business is not about being a hard ass. It's not about applying some formula better than someone else. It's being a decent person that people want to work with, that people want to work for, that people want you to work for them. And that's what I've tried to keep front of my mind for my entire career.
Is it okay with you if I just read through these 8 really quick, just so people can know what they are?
I'd love it. Sure.
Okay. So, and I love these because some of these sound like things that my dad told me when I was young. So rule number 1 is do at least 10% more than you were asked, which I love because I feel like a lot of people today do not do that. And I don't know if you want to call it an entitlement in some regards, maybe it is, but I feel like there's people don't want to do that. I don't know if you find that true or not. That's hard for a lot of people, right?
It's magic. It is magic. People who do that, it's like they're walking around with a neon sign on their head saying, I'm competent. And believe me, people get all bent out of shape about what's my job, what's my time, what's my responsibility. And I go, mellow out, just do this. And I swear the next time there's an opening, they're going to look around and they're going to pick you. It's just it's like magic.
I love it. Never, ever to anybody, as you mentioned, present as fact opinions on things you don't know, which is today something that a lot of people struggle with. Take great care and discipline, which was part of number 2. Number 3, be courteous and considerate, always up and down, which I think is very important because one of the things that we see, especially in a very strict hierarchy, is we're courteous to our peers, but oftentimes we treat those below us on the hierarchy, so to speak, differently or not as well. So I love that. Treat everybody how you want to be treated, basically, the golden rule. Number 4, don't knock, don't complain, stick to constructive, serious criticism, which it seems like was also part of Netflix's culture. Patty was actually telling me this story where one day she was in HR and somebody came to her and they were complaining about one of their coworkers. And I can't remember what the complaint was, but they were just kind of bashing this coworker and saying how terrible they are. And Patty told me the story how she says, okay, hang on a second. And she leaves the room and she goes to get the coworker that this person was bashing. And she brings him into the office and say, okay, now tell this person what you were telling me. And she told me it was this idea of like, don't talk behind people's back. Be straightforward, be honest with people. And if you have a criticism, figure it, you're a grown up, figure it out with the person directly and don't go behind people's back. And I love that story that she shared with me because I think it speaks volume to the culture that you guys had. Don't be afraid to make decisions when you have the facts on which to make them. Quantify where possible, be open-minded but skeptical, and be prompt. Such a simple one, be prompt. Ah, man, your dad was a genius.
I learned a lot from him.
Yeah.
But here's the interesting thing. Not a risk taker. I think he lived vicariously through me in that regard.
Interesting. So you did all the risk taking for everybody, huh?
I did more than enough to go around. I have some extra if you want some.
Well, and I also loved, so you had a quote in there from Nolan Bushnell, who also was a guest on this podcast. I had the opportunity to meet Nolan at an event we were both speaking at a while ago. And you said that you really liked this quote, which was, everyone who has taken a shower has an idea, but it's the people who get out of the shower, towel off, and do something about it that make the difference. And I love that because I think everybody has an idea, but very few people are, wanting to move and do something about it, which makes entrepreneurs what they are, right?
It's the thing. The singular difference between an entrepreneur and someone else is the predisposition to action. Yeah. Most people, everyone thinks of ideas. A small number of people say, let's do something about it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, maybe to wrap up, you can let people know, what are you working on these days?
Well, so I left Netflix quite a while ago.
Yeah, it's been
but Netflix is it's almost now 17 years. But Netflix was my sixth startup, so I was okay to take a break. And so I knew I didn't want to do another company, but you can't stop being an entrepreneur, and I needed some way to get my fix. So for the last bunch of years, I've been a mentor to other entrepreneurs in a pretty deep, fundamental way. I spend enough time to get to know them, know their co-founders, know their team, know their competitors, their product and market. Because, and it's not like I'm entirely altruistic here, it's because what I need is to be able to come in with them and sit around the table with these really smart people and help solve these really complicated, interesting puzzles. And that's what I love about being an entrepreneur. And I get to do that as a mentor. And then I still get to leave at 5 o'clock and get home while they stay there for hours actually doing that stuff.
Love it. Well, in the last 2 minutes, I just have a couple of rapid fire questions for you, just so people can get to know Marc as an individual a little bit more. Starting off with, what has been your most embarrassing moment?
God, I'm not going to tell you that. I can't. I have a million of them. And I would tell you, nothing jumps to mind. I don't know. I don't get embarrassed very easily.
What's your greatest business failure?
I'm sorry?
Greatest business failure, if you can't think of that one.
Oh, God, these are bad questions. Seriously. And I can't be a quick question. I need at least 30 seconds to answer, in that obviously I get asked all the time. And I'm totally sincere. I can't think of something because I try so many things and so many of them don't work that I don't see those as failures anymore. Yeah. I've had companies that have gone down, if that's what counts, but that doesn't count as a failure. Anyway, sorry.
What's your favorite business or non-business book?
I really like Shoe Dog as a business book.
Okay.
In some ways that was a model for me, that how you could write honestly and with humility about your life as a business person.
Best mentor you've ever had?
Oh, tough. I would probably say a gentleman named Philippe Kahn, founder of a company named Borland, and several others since then. Crazy, volatile, but brilliant and really taught me that you can see things that no one else sees and then act to make them happen, even though no one else sees what you're doing or why you're doing it.
All right. And last two for you. Of course, I have to ask, what are you currently binging or watching on Netflix?
Let's see. On Netflix, we're watching season 6 of Alone, which is not necessarily, I'm not even sure it's a Netflix show, but oh my gosh, it's incredible.
All
It's
right,
like Naked and Afraid, but way more intense. You'll like it, I promise.
All right. And last question for you. If you were doing a different career. Oh, sorry. What were you going to say?
That wasn't me. Go ahead.
If you were doing a different career, what do you think you would have ended up doing?
I'm pretty unemployable if I had done a different career. I think I would have ended up doing direct response, working for a catalog company or running a catalog or something like that, something predictable, but I would have been unhappy. I mean, I can't do a regular job. I need this who knows what's coming next type of experience.
Yeah, I feel the same way. Well, Marc, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. Why don't you let people know where can they go to grab your book, learn more about you, anything that you want to mention for people to check out, please feel free to do so.
Sure. I mean, obviously, the best way to get the big picture is the That Will Never Work, the book. But if you don't have the patience for 200 and some odd pages and you want it in 220 character pieces, you can get me on Twitter at MB Randolph, on Instagram at That Will Never Work. But Randolph Central is found at marcrandolph.com, which has all my writing, my speaking, my videos, and of course, where to find the book. That's Marc with a C and Randolph with a PH.
Very cool. Well, Marc, again, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your time for sharing your insights and your stories with me and with everybody else.
Thank you so much. This was actually kind of a fun one to do. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. I like to hear that. And thanks everyone for tuning in. I had a chance to read the book. I hope all of you get a chance to read the book. We just really scratched the surface of some of the really cool stories that Marc shares. So do get a copy of the book. And I will see all of you next time. Thank you very much for joining.